Chapter 3, Justices Only. Bristol read more books in just 2 weeks of cleaning the library than she had in her entire life. By the end of her first month, she had devoured every title on the ground floor and was working her way through the second level. Her quick consumption rate was thanks to an efficient schedule she developed early on. Each evening, Bristol dusted the shelves, mopped the floors, polished the silver globe, and wiped the surfaces as fast as she possibly could. When the cleaning was finished, Bristol selected a book, or a few books if it was the weekend, and snuck them back to her house. Once she finished washing the dishes from her family's dinner, Bristol would lock herself in her bedroom and spend the rest of the night reading. The following evening, Bristol would return what she had borrowed, and her secret routine would start all over again. Bristol couldn't believe how quickly her life had changed. In just 1 month, she went from having an emotional breakdown in public to the most exciting and stimulating time she had ever experienced. Working at the library gave her access to biographies, encyclopedias, dictionaries, anthologies, and textbooks that expanded her grasp of reality, and it introduced her to works of fiction, poetry, and prose that expanded her imagination beyond her wildest dreams. But perhaps most gratifying of all, Bristol found the library's copy of The Tales of Tidbit Twitch, and finally learned how the story ended. Tidbit reached in all directions as he fell off the side of the cliff, but there was nothing to grab hold of. He feared his fall would come to a brutal end against the rocky earth, but by some miracle, the mouse plunged into a rushing river instead. The dragon swooped down the cliff and flew over Tidbit as he floated in the river. The monster tried to swipe the mouse from the powerful stream, but the water was moving too fast for the dragon to get a steady grip. Tidbit thrashed around the river as it swept him toward a towering waterfall. As he rolled over the edge, the dragons dived after him with wide open jaws. The mouse was convinced these were his last moments alive. He would either be consumed by the monster above him or collide with the boulders at the base of the waterfall. As he fell farther and farther, the dragon dived closer and closer, and soon the creature's sharp teeth encompassed him in midair. Just before the monster sank its teeth into the falling mouse, Tidbit fell through a small crack between the boulders at the bottom of the waterfall, and he safely dropped into the lake at the river's end. When Tidbit surfaced in the water, he saw the dragon was spread out across the rocks behind him, lying lifeless with a broken neck. Tidbit washed ashore and took his first deep breath in years. With the dragon finally defeated, the kingdom of mice was free from the reign of terror at last. The world welcomed a new era of much-needed peace, and it was all thanks to a tiny mouse who braved a big monster. Naturally, Bristol's new routine was exhausting. She only managed to sleep for an hour or two each night, but the excitement of getting to read more the next day energized her like a drug. However, Bristol found clever ways of resting so she wasn't entirely sleep-deprived. During Miss Plume's lessons at school, Bristol tied a quill to her fingers and lowered her gaze so she appeared to be taking notes, but was actually taking a much-needed nap instead. On one occasion, while her classmates learned how to apply makeup, Crystal used the supplies to draw pupils on her eyelids so no one noticed she was sleeping through the demonstrations. At lunch, while the other girls went to the bakery in the town square, Bristol visited the furniture store and tested the products until the owners caught on. On the weekends, Bristol snoozed in between her chores at the Evergreen house. At church, she spent the majority of the service with her eyes closed, pretending to pray. Luckily, her brothers did the same thing, so her parents never noticed. Aside from the fatigue, Bristol thought her scheme was going very smoothly, and she didn't face anywhere near as much suspicion as she had feared. She only saw her family for a few minutes each morning, so there wasn't much time for them to question her about her daily activities. Everyone was so focused on Barry's inaugural weeks as a deputy justice that they never even asked about her volunteering for the House for the Hopeless. Still, Bristol had developed stories about feeding the hungry and bathing the sick in case she needed them. The only hitch happened at the beginning of her second month of employment. One evening, Bristol entered the library to find Mr. Woolsore on his hands and knees searching under the furniture. "Mr. Woolsore, can I help you with something?" she asked. "I'm looking for Champions of the Champions, Volume 3, Mr. Woolsore explained. "A student requested it this afternoon, and it's vanished from the shelves." Unbeknownst to the librarian, Bristol had borrowed Champions of the Champions Volume 3 the night before. She pulled her coat a little tighter around her shoulders so the librarian wouldn't see that the book was tucked under her arm. "I'm sure it's here somewhere," she said. "Would you like me to help you look?" No, he grumped and got to his feet. "The assistant librarian probably filed it incorrectly. Idiot, man. Just leave it on the counter if it shows up while you're cleaning." Once Mr. Woolsore was gone, Bristol left Champions of the Champions Volume 3 on the counter. It was a simple remedy to a simple situation, but Bristol didn't want to experience a closer call to getting caught. To avoid any future risk, Bristol decided it would be wise if she stopped sneaking books home altogether. From then on, after she finished cleaning, Bristol stayed at the library to read. Sometimes she didn't return home until the early hours of the morning and had to sneak back into the house through a window. At first, Bristol welcomed the change to her schedule. The empty library was very peaceful at night and the perfect place to get lost in a good book. Sometimes the moon shone so brightly through the glass ceiling she didn't even need a lantern to see the pages. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before Bristol became too comfortable with the new setup. One morning, Bristol was awoken by the cathedral bells, but they were different this morning. Instead of the distant ringing that gradually stirred her awake, a thunderous changing caused her to jump to her feet. The noise was so sudden and alarming, it was discombobulating. When she finally gained consciousness of her whereabouts, Bristol received her second shock of the morning. She wasn't standing in her bedroom. She was still at the library. "Oh no!" she gasped. "I fell asleep reading. Father will be furious if he realizes I've been gone all night. I've got to get home before Mother notices my bed is empty." Bristol tucked her reading glasses into the top of her dress, stashed the books she had been reading on the nearest shelf, and ran out of the library as fast as she could. Outside, the cathedral bells were causing a hurricane of noise in the town square. Bristol covered her ears and had trouble staying upright as she was hit by a wave after wave of sound. She dashed down the path toward the eastern countryside and reached the Evergreen home just as the final bell tolled. When she arrived, Miss Evergreen was standing on the front porch, frantically looking in every direction for her daughter. Her shoulders sank almost an entire foot when she saw Bristol approaching. "Where on God's green earth have you been?" she yelled. "You had me worried half to death. I almost sent for the King's Royal Guard." "I'm so sorry, Mother," Bristol panted. I can't explain." "There better be a good reason why you weren't in your bed this morning." It was an accident," Bristol said, and quickly fabricated an excuse. "I was up late making beds at the home for the hopeless. The beds looked so comfortable I couldn't resist lying down. The next thing I heard were the bells this morning. Oh, please forgive me. I'll go inside and do the dishes from dinner right away." Bristol tried to go inside the house, but Miss Evergreen blocked the front door. "This isn't about the dishes," her mother said. "You can't imagine the fright you gave me. I convinced myself you were lying dead in an alley somewhere. Don't ever do that to me. Again. Ever." "I won't. I promise," Bristol said. "Honestly, it was just a silly accident. I didn't mean to worry you." Please don't tell Father about this. If he finds out I was gone all night, he'll never let me volunteer at the Home for the Helpless again." Bristol was in such a panic she couldn't tell if her performance was convincing or not. The look behind her mother's eyes was difficult to decipher, too. Miss Evergreen seemed convinced and unconvinced at the same time, like she knew her daughter wasn't telling the truth, but was choosing to believe her lies. "This volunteering," Miss Evergreen said. "Whatever it entails, you must be more careful if you don't want to lose it. Your father will have no problem taking it away if he thinks it's making you irresponsible." "I know," Bristol said, "and it'll never happen again, I swear." Miss Evergreen nodded and softened her stern glare. "Good. I may only see you for a few minutes each morning, but I can tell volunteering is making you happy," she said. "You've been a different person since you started. It's nice to see you so content. I would hate for anything to change that." "It makes me very happy, Mother," Bristol said. "Actually, I didn't realize I could be so happy." Despite her daughter's excitement, something about Bristol's enthusiasm made Miss Evergreen noticeably sad. "Well, that's wonderful, dear," she said with an unconvincing smile. "I'm pleased to hear it." "You don't seem very pleased," Bristol said. "What's the matter, Mother? Am I not supposed to be happy?" "What? No, of course not. Everyone deserves a little happiness now and then. Everyone. And nothing makes me happier than knowing you're happy. It's just... What?" Miss Evergreen smiled at her daughter again, but this time Bristol knew it was genuine. "I just miss having you around, that's all," she admitted. "Now get upstairs before your father or brothers see you. I'll do the dishes while you wash up. When you're finished, you can help me in the kitchen. Happiness or no happiness, breakfast doesn't cook itself." The following week, Bristol took her mother's advice to heart. To prevent herself from falling asleep in the library again, Bristol limited her nightly reading to just 1 hour after she finished her evening duties. 2 hours at the most if she found something really good. Before packing up and heading home, she didn't get to read nearly as much as she wanted, but any time at the library was better than none. Late one night, while searching for something to read, Bristol strolled down a long, winding hall on the second floor. All of the sections in the library, she figured this was the least popular because it always needed the most dusting. The shelves were filled with collections of old public records and outdated ordinances, so it was no mystery why the hall was virtually forgotten. As Bristol browsed the shelves at the end of the hall, a book on the very top shelf caught her attention. Unlike all the leather-bound records surrounding it, this book had a wooden cover and practically blended into the wooden shelf. Bristol had never noticed a strange book before, and as she marveled at its peculiar camouflage, she began wondering if anyone had ever noticed it. Could there be books in this library that have never been read before? She wondered aloud. What if I'm the first person to read something? The notion was very exciting. Bristol rolled a ladder to the end of the hall and climbed to the top shelf. She tried to retrieve the wooden book, but it didn't budge. It's probably been sitting here for centuries, she speculated. Bristol pulled on the book again, with all her strength, but it didn't move. Her feet rose off the ladder as she used all her weight to try to pry it loose, but even that didn't help. No matter how hard she tried, the wooden book wouldn't part from the shelf. It must be nailed down. What kind of a sick person would nail a book to? Ah! Without warning, Bristol and the ladder were knocked to the floor by something large and heavy. When she looked up, Bristol discovered that the entire bookcase had swung away from the wall to reveal a long and dark hallway hidden behind it. She quickly realized the wooden book wasn't a book at all. It was a lever to a secret door. Hello? Bristol nervously called into the hallway. Is someone there? The only thing she heard was her own voice echoing back to her. If anyone can hear me, I'm sorry about this, she said. I was just cleaning the shelf and it opened. I wasn't expecting to find a door to wherever this creepy hall leads. Once again, there was no reply. Bristol assumed the hidden corridor was just as empty as the rest of the library and didn't see any harm in inspecting it. She retrieved a lantern and slowly walked down the hall to see where it led. At the end of the hallway, Bristol found a wide metal door with a plaque bolted on it. Justices only. Justices only, Bristol read aloud. That's strange. Why would the justices need a secret room in the library? She reached for the doorknob and her heart fluttered when she felt it was unlocked. The metal door creaked open and the sound echoed into the empty library behind her. Curiosity overpowered her judgment, and before Bristol could stop herself, she disregarded the sign and stepped through the door. Hello? Is anyone there? She asked. Innocent maid coming through. Bristol found a small room with a low ceiling on the other side of the door. Luckily, it was just as vacant as she had predicted. The walls had no windows or artwork, but were lined with black bookcases. The only furniture was a small table and a single chair in the center of the room. An empty candlestick adorned the table, and a coat rack stood beside it with only 2 hooks, for 1 hat and 1 coat. Based on the minimal furnishings, Bristol figured the room was meant for only 1 justice at a time. She put on her reading glasses and raised her lantern toward a bookcase to see what kind of books were kept in the secret library. To her surprise, the justice's collection was sparse. Each shelf contained less than a dozen titles, and every book was next to a file of paperwork. Bristol selected the thickest book from the nearest shelf and read the cover. History and Other Lies by Robert Flagworth. The title was difficult to read because the book was coated in ash. Bristol moved her lantern closer and saw that the front cover had been branded with a word in large lettering. Banned. Banned? Bristol read aloud. Well, that seems silly. Why would anyone need to ban a book? She flipped the book open and read the first page it turned to. After skimming a few paragraphs, Bristol had her answer. One of the greatest deceptions in recorded history was the reasoning for the Declawing Act of 339. For hundreds of years, the people of the Southern Kingdom have been told that King Champion the Eighth banished the trolls for acts of vulgarity, but this was nothing but propaganda to disguise a macabre plot against an innocent species. Prior to the Declawing Act of 339, the trolls were respected participants in Southern Kingdom society. They were gifted craftsmen and built many of the structures that still stand in the Chariot Hills town square today. They lived quietly in the caves of the southwest region and were regarded as a peaceful and private minority. In 336, while expanding their caves in the southwest, the trolls uncovered a large amount of gold. At the time, the Southern Kingdom was still crippled with debt from the Four Corners World War. Upon learning of the trolls' newfound wealth, Champion the Eighth claimed the gold was government property and ordered the trolls to turn it over at once. Legally, the trolls had every right to keep their discovery, and they refused the king's demands. In retaliation, King Champion the Eighth and his high justices orchestrated a sinister ploy to tarnish the trolls' reputation. They spread nasty falsehoods about the trolls' lifestyle and behavior, and after time, the residents of the Southern Kingdom started believing the rumors. The king banished the trolls to the in-between, seized their gold, and successfully brought the Southern Kingdom out of debt. Sadly, the leaders of neighboring kingdoms were inspired by the Declawing Act of 339, and use the same method to erase their own debts. Soon the trolls were unjustly ransacked and exiled from all four kingdoms. Other intelligent species came to the trolls' defense, but their efforts only caused them to suffer a similar fate. Together, world leaders instituted the Great Cleansing Act of 345, which expelled all talking creatures other than humans from their kingdoms. The troll, elf, ogre, and goblin populations lost their homes and their possessions and were forced into the harsh environments of the in-between. With limited resources, the species had no choice but to resort to the barbaric and primitive survival measures they're resented and feared for today. The so-called monsters of the in-between are not humankind's enemy, but humankind's creation. Bristol had to read the excerpt twice before she fully understood what it was saying. Was Robert Flagworth exaggerating, or was the declawing act of 339 as dishonest as he implied? And judging by the size of his book, if the author was correct, then the Southern Kingdom's history was jam-packed with other fabrications. At first, the idea of history being dishonest was difficult for Bristol to comprehend. She didn't want to believe a topic she knew so much about was filled with lies, but the more she thought it over, the more plausible it seemed. After all, the Southern Kingdom was a blatantly flawed and oppressive country. Why should she believe it was an honest place? Bristol continued looking through the bookcases and selected another title that caught her eye. The War on Women by Daisy Peppernickel. Just like the previous book, The War on Women was covered in ash and branded with the word banned. With one quick glance at the pages inside, Bristol was instantly captivated by the subject matter. The female mind is not the fragile flower pot we're made to believe. According to many studies on human anatomy, there is no evidence to suggest a woman's brain is any weaker, slower, or less capable than a man's. So the question remains, why are we kept from education and positions of power? Because the justices use the oppression of women as an instrument to maintain their grip on the Southern Kingdom. By nature, women are more maternal than men. If we ruled the Southern Kingdom, we would govern on principles of enlightenment, empathy, and nourishment. But the justices in the current court system can only function in a society operated by fear, scrutiny, and punishment. If the country began valuing compassion over control, the justices and their governing techniques would be rendered obsolete. That is why they take every step necessary to prevent women from rising above them. From the moment we're born, women are brainwashed to prioritize motherhood and marriage over intellect and personal fulfillment. We're handed baby dolls and aprons and told our greatest contributions are accomplished in the nursery and the kitchen. But that lie is as damaging as it is degrading, because a kingdom is only as strong as its weakest citizen. And a society with unjust limitations is less likely to prevail than a country of equal opportunity. When a nation segregates any percentage of its population, it only segregates a percentage of its potential. So for the sake of the kingdom, it is time for women to stand together and demand a new government that values every citizen's thoughts, ideas, and morals. Then and only then will our country journey into realms of prosperity it has never seen before. Bristol's mouth dropped open. It was like she was reading a book of her own thoughts. She had never heard anyone else speak about the things she believed, let alone see them printed in a book. She stacked The War on Women and History and Other Lies on the table, eager to finish them later. But first she wanted to see what other books were in the secret library. Another enticing title she found was called Losing Faith in Faith by Quint Cuppamule. Like the previous books, it too had banned branded into its cover. Bristol opened the book to a random page to get a sense of what it was about. If the Book of Faith was as pure as the monks claim it is, there would be no need to amend it or publish versions over time. However, if you compared a current Book of Faith to one from 100 years ago, you would discover vast differences between the religion of today and the religion of yesterday. So what does this mean? Has the Lord simply changed his mind over the years? Has the great Almighty corrected his mistakes after being convinced he was wrong? But wouldn't the very notion of being wrong contradict the all-knowing qualities the Lord is supposed to possess? The truth is, what started as a joyful and loving faith is now a politically motivated ruse to control the people of the Southern Kingdom. Whenever the fear of incarceration is not enough to make people obey the law, the justices alter the principles of religion and use the fear of eternal damnation to enforce their agenda. The law and the Lord should be separate entities, but the Southern Kingdom has strategically made them the same. Therefore, any activity or opinion that questions the government is considered a sin, and every lifestyle or preference that doesn't help expand the population is considered demonic. The Book of Faith no longer reflects the Lord's will, but the will of men who use the Lord as a tool to manipulate their people. Bristol was absolutely fascinated by Quint Cappamule's writing. In all her years attending church, she had never questioned the monks' sermons denouncing murder and theft, but she had always wondered why the monks preached just as passionately about the importance of paying taxes. Now it appeared Bristol had her answer. She put Losing Faith in Faith in her stack and continued searching through the bookcases. The next banned title that gained her interest was called The Injustice of the Justices, How the King is Only a Pawn to a Monarchy in Disguise, by Sherpel Hinderback. As she moved the book off the shelf, Bristol accidentally knocked over the file of paperwork placed next to it. The document spilled onto the floor, and Bristol knelt as she picked up the mess. Until this moment, Bristol hadn't had much interest in the files throughout the bookcases, but now she couldn't help reading the papers as she restacked them. Among the paperwork was a detailed profile of the author Sherpel Hinderback. It was followed by a log on Hinderback's whereabouts over a period of years. The addresses became more and more obscure with time. What started as houses and inns became bridges and caverns. The dates of the entries also became closer and closer together, as if Hinderback had changed his location more and more frequently. The log ended with a warrant for the author's arrest, and finally the paperwork concluded with his death certificate. The cause of death was executed for conspiracy against the kingdom. Bristol got to her feet and inspected the files beside the books of Robert Flagworth, Daisy Peppernickel, and Quint Cappamule. Similar to the documents in the previous files, she found profiles of the authors, records of their residences, warrants for their arrests, and eventually their death certificates. And just like Sherpel Hinderback, each author's cause of death was executed for conspiracy against the kingdom. As if struck by a cold breeze, Bristol had chills and her body went tense. She felt sick to her stomach as she looked around and recognized the small room for what it truly was. This wasn't a private library. It was a graveyard for truth and an archive of people the justices had silenced. They killed them, Bristol said in shock. They killed them all. In time, the books throughout the secret room would introduce Bristol to an assortment of troubling ideas. Her perspective of the world would change forever, but most troubling of all, one of these books was going to change Bristol's view of herself. and once she read it, she would never look into a mirror the same way again.